have to bring in a different kinds of process. So when we're talking about creativity, despite all these times our society which seems to indicate it's just this like monolithic, magical something, it's actually got lots of different components, and I think it serves as well to address some of these components individually. If for no other reason, then there are very particular kinds of attributes attached to the different states, different components, different phases. I mentioned in that little bit of blur, there's different kinds of psychological states, for example, associated with certain stages of creative processes, which are completely different to the appropriate psychological states appropriate to other phases of the creative process. And I'll maybe flesh that out in a few minutes. There's different kinds of social demands placed upon you at different stages. And you'll probably know this yourself. At this stage, if you're the creative process in your MA, you're in one particular set of demands that are upon you. It'll be very different when you're a week away from the deadline. Am I right? Yeah. So that's an institutional social demand, and that's a very shapes the creative process in a very different way. And all sorts of kind of cultural and personal things. There's lots of different tangents and vectors into this stuff. So it isn't unitary. It is important to recognise it as a series of different parts, machinic parts. Obviously, we can't talk about them all today. I know I wouldn't pretend to. Most of my previous research has been on particular parts of creative processes, sometimes called illumination. It's not what I'm going to be talking about today. But many models of creative processes have this phase that they sometimes call illumination or breakthrough, or those kinds of terms. When it all kind of comes together. That's not the phase we're going to be talking about today, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I'll just suggest why before I flesh it down. A lot of the creative processes you'll come across, and Devona is a fantastic example of this, are not so much about creative processes in the arts, they're more about creative problem solving. They are about finding solutions to well-articulated problems. And a lot of arts activity is not about finding creative solutions to well-articulated problems. So although you might get all kinds of feelings, all kinds of psychological effects might be produced, all kinds of social effects, you might feel exuberant, you might feel very happy, you might feel satisfied, all those things might happen. It's unlikely you'll get those eureka moments that you get in invention or in those kinds of problem-solving models that Devona particularly is associated with. Those tend not to happen in the art. There's a very different kind of shape to creative processes in the arts. And for that reason, I'm not going to be focusing on these eureka moments, because they're a bit illusory, I think, if we dwell too much on those in arts practice. It's more useful, I think, more generative, and more realistic in terms of how artists actually work, I think, to focus on a slightly earlier stage, which I've called the generative stage, the stage in which stuff is being made, stuff is being produced. And if I understand what you've been saying correctly, and what Carol said correctly, the exercises you were doing this morning were predominantly to do with the generative stage. They were to do with making stuff, responding very quickly, not thinking about it, not dwelling on it, not going away and shaping it carefully. If there was any shaping, it was very quick shaping. So that was a generative stage that you're involved in there. Alright? So I want to see if I can address that and pull out the prominence and prevalence of that. The second thing I want to do, which is the second paragraph of that blurb, is to do with this idea of public and private. I'll say more about this in a minute, but what I'm trying to suggest with that paragraph is that certainly from the outside, creative practice in the arts and elsewhere is considered to be a kind of private activity. It happens either in you, it might be generative, it might be eureka moments, there might be all kinds of things going on, but it's a private thing happening either in the individual or happening in the closed group. A group of people get together in a studio and they worry away at it for a while. It's a very private kind of thing. And so almost all of that creativity happens in that kind of private domain. And it's only when whatever it is you're making, the invention, the art, the novel, the film, is completely finished, is it released to the public. That's, if you like, the default setting. That's the one I think we tend to assume is the case. But what I want to suggest, and again I think you'll be very familiar once we start talking about it, is that model is in motion right now. I think changes are happening to it. And some potentially more interesting things are happening in which creativity and creative processes are generally not happening in individuals or in closed groups. A lot of the time they're happening in public. And I think a lot of that is because of new technologies, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So that's the second thing I want to talk about. Yeah? And I'll try to relate them together. The third thing, which I didn't include in the blurb, it's kind of buried in the first paragraph, but it didn't make it all blurb, is where I want to start really, which is to do with knowledge. And what I want to start with is just to talk a little bit about some of my own work on knowledge, my doctoral dissertation on some stuff to do with knowledge. And the reason why I think it might be useful for us to talk about it is because you are engaged right now, because you're a student, you're engaged in the knowledge industries, if you like. It is required that you make a contribution to knowledge by the end of your studies. That's kind of how it's framed, yeah. Once you've graduated, if you don't want to further study, you may not use that kind of language again, but just make art, or make choreography, or make theatre or something like that. But within this context, you are contributing to knowledge, and that's quite a hard thing, isn't it? You can't feel that. I mean, has it been discussed in those terms? Have you thought of that?
A little bit, yeah. Robert touched on it almost a bit in the knowledge, saying that, that's essentially what is required, is that something new, or some new knowledge which is created.
Yeah. And how do you respond to that? What kind of things went through your mind, or what kind of notes did you make at that point?
Well, we're kind of discussing the whole aspect of what is new.
Right.
Like you kind of like, if we remix things that have gone before, would that be new?
Okay.
Okay. It made me think about my research questions, and whether it's defined or not yet.
Yeah.
I thought about it like the way you just said, that we have to have contributed to knowledge before we think, like, by the end of this process, we have to have contributed to this thing called knowledge. But yeah.
It's tricky if you don't really know what that thing called knowledge is.
Yeah, I understand the concept, but I haven't kind of thought of that I've got to contribute to this thing.
Yeah. Okay, what I just want to spend about 20 minutes doing is just kind of looking at that concept that we get, that concept of knowledge that we get. And what I want to suggest is that we don't get it in quite the way that we think we're getting it. I think there's a lot going on when we talk about knowledge. And there's a lot of assumptions that we make. And there's a lot of assumptions that Edward de Bono makes, which are not necessarily either fully articulated in a way that we can use them, or else they're articulated in a way which is not useful to us, which is counterproductive. Yeah? I just want to bring up. Okay, this is my doctoral thesis. It's online, and I'm going to talk about why it's online in a few minutes. But the subject of my dissertation was to do with knowledge. How we as it started out actually thinking how we as artists can do that thing that we've been talking about here. What does it mean when we contribute to knowledge? Because if you read about knowledge, it doesn't. Most of the literature doesn't say anything about art. It talks about things like problem solving, or it talks about things like significant insights, or it talks about invention, or it talks about facts and theories. And a lot of it is quite difficult if you want to try and apply that to arts practice. And it can be a pretty kind of Procrustean exercise. You're having to modify what you do to make it fit within an established model. You may kind of get a sense of that already. You're having to shift what is an arts practice to something that fits the model of what knowledge creation is. And that's really the topic I'm interested in with that. I won't take you through the whole thing. It's 250,000 words long, but the general thesis that I'm developing in this site is that the way we think about knowledge is built around a series of metaphors. And they're revealed in our language. It doesn't just metaphors don't just exist in language; they exist in our most fundamental part of